Hey, everybody, and welcome to our first recorded lecture of this course. So the way this lecture is going to be structured is that it's going to be just a very brief overview of some of the key concepts in the first five chapters, which is the assigned reading for this week. This is an intensive course, as I'm sure you all are aware, and so there's a lot to get done in a short amount of time. And so, I didn't want to create a lengthy lecture on each chapter, just realizing that practically speaking, I don't know that you would have time to watch all that. I also think the book we're using, I think does a nice job of explaining things. I think it is not, it doesn't get into academic speak too much, this over intellectualization of things. And so I do think, reading the book, as I was reading through this book in preparation for the course this summer, I really thought this is a book that I think we can all read and understand exactly what he's talking about. I think there's some good examples to go along with the material. So really, I just want this to be uh, a reiteration of some of the concepts. I think it can be helpful sometimes to read it and then hear someone talk about it. So this is not going to be an in-depth. I'm talking about every single thing in this book. It is meant to be a kind of an overview. That being said, it's also not. I'm not hitting the concepts that I think are necessarily. I'm not trying to prioritize the concepts in here versus all of the ones in the book. The ones I'll talk about today are just ones that have stood out to me in clinical work and stood out to me while I was reading. So hopefully that'll be helpful. Again, I'm going to try to keep it relatively brief, just so that it is feasible to watch this along with the other material and the readings that you'll be doing this week. If I can get the slides to go. Here we go. All right. So here's the learning objectives for this presentation. They are essentially mapped to the first five chapters. So we're going to talk about the history of homosexuality and LGBTQ plus issues within the counseling field. Learn the fundamentals of gay affirmative therapy. Talk about the key concepts related to growing up gay, lesbian, or bisexual, so looking developmentally at the kids and adolescents. Acquire knowledge of covert cultural sexual abuse, so we'll talk about what that term means and how it shows up for clients, and then learn the causes and symptoms of trauma from growing up LGBTQ plus. So those are generally what we're going to talk about here, but also again they're kind of mapped to the chapters 1 through 5. So to talk about the development of homosexuality as a topic within the counseling field or therapy field. It's important to understand kind of the etiology of how it's been viewed and where it comes from, again, within the context of our field. So, the book talks about this, but there was a shift toward the end of the 19th century. So we're talking, kind of mid to late 1800s, where homosexuality was talked about and discussed mainly in religious and legal contexts. And so those are the kind of the realms of life, the realms of society where homosexuality was a topic of conversation. And as you might imagine, very discriminatory beliefs and very harmful ways of putting societal structures in place to address homosexuality at that point, whether it be again through the religious mechanisms or legal mechanisms. But around that time, we see a shift into the medical context, and this is where we can begin thinking about the kind of the beginnings of pathological thinking around homosexuality is when it gets into the medical field and medical treatment, which has this kind of etiological model, right? We look developmentally back to history and try to understand why things have developed the way that they have. And so when it made it into the medical context at the end of the 19th century is really when the beginning of a kind of formal pathologizing homosexuality took place. So if you kind of fast forward that, we often talk about Sigmund Freud as one of the founders of talk therapy, right? Which he really was therapy as a field. When Sigmund Freud came along, was very inhumane. Mental health issues were treated in a very inhumane way, and he put forward talk therapy as an alternative, a more humane alternative. And you can, might have feelings about his particular theory of choice or him, or he was kind of an eccentric person, but one of the things that is a kind of a misnomer or misrepresented sometimes is that Sigmund Freud pathologized homosexuality and kind of contributed toward the pathologizing of homosexuality, which, if you look back at his actual writings and work, is not true. He did question the role, obviously, of sexuality in human development and in contributing to mental health concerns. I mean, that sexuality was his theoretically was his main driver, but he did not make links explicitly between homosexuality and pathology. So it's just important to recognize that that was not true. Even from the beginnings of therapy, there were not links between developmental sexuality and pathologizing homosexuality. So, talking about the medical field and then kind of homosexuality as viewed within our context of counseling, the DSM is obviously a critical document in any type of counseling or the medical field because it really does, uh, outline and is used as the document for our healthcare system. And so it's really important to understand how homosexuality showed up there. And so it was listed as a disorder in the DSM until 1973. So we're talking about about 50 years ago. Um, and it was thankfully it was taken out that homosexuality disorder was taken out of the DSM in 1973. However, it basically they just changed the semantics around it, right? They changed the wording of it, and so things like ego, dystonic, homosexual, sexual disorder, not otherwise specified, were essentially substituted for diagnosing someone with homosexuality as a mental health disorder. And so the verbiage changed, but really people were using it, you know, as the mechanistically as the same thing, right? Diagnostically as the same thing as diagnosing homosexuality. Um, Thankfully, when the DSM-5 came out in 2013, it removed all of that. It really did try to get rid of this idea that homosexuality is a disorder because we know it's not. So, but I mean, you think about that. That's 2013. We're talking less than 10 years ago that it was completely removed as even these kind of workaround diagnostic labels like sexual disorder not otherwise specified were removed as a way to just solidify in the DSM that this is not a disorder. This is not there's not something wrong with people who are homosexual. It is a way of being. It's who they are, and it's the societal factors that have contributed to us our perception, and I say our, meaning broadly speaking, society, the perception of homosexuality as something harmful or something that's unhealthy. So DSM-5, it took us this long to get to where it is not included in there, but thankfully we have gotten here. So it'd be interesting to see how issues around sexuality are, how they show up in the DSM moving forward, because I know there's revisions coming to the DSM-5. So that is kind of the diagnostic side of things. Historically, treatments for homosexuality have been highly inhumane. I mean, you could argue that any kind of treatment, if you even want to call it that, towards working with homosexuals individuals would be inhumane, right? I mean, because you could make an argument. I think that the argument is there that any trying to treat something that is just natural to someone is inhumane. But these are the treatment methods that we know were used: electroshock therapy, castration, hysterectomy, clitoridectomy, lobotomy, various drug and hormone therapy. So you'll notice that these were kind of labeled as aversion therapies. They really were meant to change biologically what was happening. I mean, if you think about the number 2, 3, and 4 there, castration, hysterectomy, clitoridectomy are literally genitalia and reproductive manipulation is so literally getting in there and changing someone's genitalia or reproductive system in the hopes that it would, down here at the bottom line, result in either asexual or heterosexual orientation. So the actual goal was to change someone's sexual orientation by changing um, their biology. That was the goal. Electroshock therapy, that is electroshock therapy. Obviously, is still in use today. Not for this, but for very different cases. And it's come a long way. But that was one of those, trying to change the biologically or chemically what was happening in the brain, hoping that it would result in a change in sexual orientation. And then drug and hormone therapies. A lot of those are again very inhumane. It's getting at the biological components, trying to change those, which we know ultimately doesn't work. It just causes severe damage. So the result was to change sexual orientation or, kind of remove sexual desires in the case of, asexual orientation. And luckily, most of these have fallen out of practice. There are still, the book mentions there are still some pockets uh, of treatment. A lot of them have fallen under kind of the religious umbrella, so very kind of conservative religious organizations might still be operating some form of conversion therapy. They may talk about it now. Hopefully, it's not this. Hopefully it's not existing at all, but most of the conversion therapy happening today is not this kind of physical manipulation. It is more of a working with the mental health and psychology of individuals. Still inhumane, but it is happening in pockets around the U.S. So it's important to know that this still is a thing. Speaking of, so conversion therapy laws have become a important topic in our field, and what they are is basically, the counseling field, most therapy fields are regulated at the state level. Really, that's why we do state licensure. And most of the boundaries and laws and regulations around what therapy is, who can practice it, what they can practice, all those kinds of things are set at the state level. And so, conversion therapy, meaning, therapy that is meant to intentionally alter someone's sexual orientation or affectual orientation, has been a topic in our field, and it has been a topic amongst regulators for a while now. But you can see here, this is a map, and this is pretty recent, of the state of conversion therapy laws in the US. So you can see there in the dark green, 20 states have laws that have just outright banned conversion therapy for minors. And this is dealing with minors in particular because minors have reduced legal rights anyway, right? I mean, if a child or adolescent's parents want them to be in therapy for whatever, they just bring them, right? I mean, the child may choose not to participate, or may resist the process, but the parents still have the legal rights to seek treatment for their kids. And so that is why this is focusing on conversion therapy for minors, because minors don't have that autonomy in the treatment that they receive, or at least the degree of autonomy that adults do. So 20 states there, you can see they're mostly concentrated kind of in the Northeast and out on the West Coast. The green with kind of the stripes there are partial bans of conversion therapy for minors, and so these differ by state, but they have some combination of loopholes that would allow people to seek conversion therapy treatment. But then there are other regulations in place, certain conditions that prevent it from happening. So you can see there are 5 states there. The orange color there with the stripes are states that have introduced conversion therapy laws, and then they were appealed or bogged down into the federal system to see if they are legal or not for those states. So you can see all of those are concentrated in the Southeast there, the Alabama, Georgia, and Florida. And then states with no law or policy related to conversion therapy are really in the central U.S. There's some scattering of them on the East Coast, but it's mainly kind of the center of the country there where there's no state law or policy around conversion therapy. So, the drawing on your ethics and law class, remember this we're talking about laws here. And so this is not talking about, stances from professional organizations like the ACA has outright very clearly articulated that conversion therapy is unethical. APA, the American Psychological Association, has done the same. So there are professional movements to try to reduce and get rid of conversion therapy. But what we're talking about here are the legal aspects, right? The regulatory and legal aspects that are going in place. You will see Virginia here banned conversion therapy for minors. That was pretty recent. That was in the last couple of years that Virginia past that, so it was good to see that. So this is a good website. I put the link down there. If you want to take a look at it, you can get into a little more detail um, around some of the legal proceedings by state. So you can click that link and play around on the website. It's got a lot of good information there. All right, so moving to chapter 2, which is on gay affirmative therapy. The big takeaway, I think, around gay affirmative therapy is that this is not just about acceptance and non-judgmental approaches. That is the baseline for any therapy. It needs to be there with working with individuals from the LGBTQ plus population, but it is absolutely not enough. And so gay affirmative therapy is really about these kind of last two bullet points on the slide. Understanding and combating heterosexism and heterosexual privilege is critical. And so just acknowledging both for the client and for ourselves and for society as a whole that heterosexism and heterosexual privilege do affect things. They have affected things. They are affecting things. They will show up in the relationship with the client. And so just acknowledging that, working to combat it. So trying to, I always think about first you have to be aware of it to work on anything. So recognizing for yourself where it shows up, very intentionally, thinking about where it shows up for the client, exploring that with them, and then figuring out what does that mean in your relationship. And then what does it mean also for the client, broadly speaking, out in the world? Uh, Gay affirmative therapy also explores trauma, shame, alienation, isolation, neglect experience. And so these are things that we know show up for all clients in the LGBTQ plus community. And so intentionally exploring those, asking questions about them is really critical for meeting our clients where they are and just acknowledging their experience. It's very different than just kind of taking a passive approach of like, oh, well, if it matters to the client, they'll bring it up. This is saying, no, if you're working with someone in this community, then you need to intentionally explore it because it is part of their experience. All the evidence suggests it is. And if we are going to affirm their experience, we need to come in with that working knowledge of what they may have struggled with and ask them questions about it and be open to their experience and to do that work. So that is what makes gay affirmative therapy different than just kind of a general acceptance and I treat everybody equally on who they are. This is saying no, we need to recognize that clients in the LGBTQ plus community have a different experience. We know they do. All the evidence suggests it, and that means that we need to pay attention to it. So that is what gay affirmative therapy is. Common errors that are made and these are made sometimes with the best of intention, wanting to be affirmative with our clients. But they do show up in the literature as things that can cause a hindrance or a barrier or in the therapeutic relationship. So not disclosing your own sexual orientation when asked. So this can be, this is I think this can be a tough one because we often talk about not using self-disclosure in the counseling relationship, around our personal lives, right? So we want to be really cautious around self-disclosure just in general, especially as we're beginning counselors and we might rely on self-disclosure to connect with clients. But here, the evidence suggests that if you're working with someone from the LGBTQ plus community and they do ask you about your sexual orientation, it can be helpful to be transparent about that. Because sexual orientation is such a critical part of the human experience, and particularly clients in the LGBTQ plus community, acting closed off about that with your clients can actually be harmful to the therapeutic process. So just know that, and know that, going into counseling work, if you're working with clients in the LGBTQ plus community, that self-disclosing your own sexual orientation when asked can be a helpful thing, and that there's no evidence that it needs to align, right? I mean, it's not about you needing to have the same sexual orientation as your client. It's just there's an openness about talking about it, and so that can be a helpful piece to know. Denying your own homophobia and heterosexism. If you've taken the cross-cultural class, we talk about this a lot, but we all have biases. We all have a lot of them, right? And um, it's not necessarily all that helpful to judge them when we recognize them, but it is helpful to be aware of them and understand how they're coming into our relationship. So this is no different than when we're talking about, working with clients who are homosexual or part of the LGBTQ plus community. We need to understand our own experiences, our own perceptions around homophobia and heterosexism, and recognize that they will show up in some form, and we need to be able to address them when they do. Using the wrong terminology. This is one, oddly enough, when I have been talking to colleagues, um, counseling colleagues out in the community, and told them that we were teaching this class this summer. This is one that a lot of people mention to me, that they have a fear of using the wrong terminology, whether that be around things like sexual orientation, or whether it be using the wrong pronouns. And so we do have a obligation to understand and use proper terminology. Um, we definitely have an obligation to use the terminology that our clients prefer that we use. And, you know, we are going to all make mistakes at times. I mean, it's just, we're human, we're going to make mistakes. And so I think if when we make mistakes, it's about acknowledging it, apologizing, quickly correcting, and not trying our best not to make the same mistake again. Using the wrong term over and over and over again, can indicate to our clients that we're really not thinking about it at a deep level. We're not acknowledging who they are, and their identity. And obviously we don't want to do that. So using proper terminology, that also carries over. I don't know that I need to do a better job of this. But when we are talking about clients, not personifying their labels, meaning not saying things like my homosexual client, right? Like we shouldn't be saying things like my schizophrenic client, my borderline client. It depersonalizes who they are, and it just labels them as a diagnosis as opposed to an individual. So that's another angle at the terminology piece that we want to be really careful. That's probably more on the kind of supervision or collegial support side of things if you're doing a case presentation or something like that. But just be really careful to not it's another form of pathologizing, right? This isn't an individual. This is a diagnosis I'm working with, and we definitely don't want to do that. So, being really thoughtful about using the proper terminology is helpful. Um, the systems we have in place, intake systems, paperwork, processes, some of that we may have limited control over just depending on where you work. But making sure that the paperwork processes, intake, all that kind of stuff um, is not embodying heterosexist terminology, and so and advocating for change if it needs to change can be really helpful. So if you have some autonomy, just making sure that things are very very open and inclusive on the paperwork and processes side can be really helpful. This next one I thought was interesting. Being a blank slate as a therapist, there's this. I think there is an idea, a concept in therapy that the counselor needs to be a blank slate, this objective kind of sounding board for the client, uh, which some theoretical orientations emphasize this more than others. But we do know the evidence suggests that being a blank slate as a therapist in a counseling relationship with a member of the LGBTQ plus community is not going to be effective, right? Individuals, and I would argue, most folks want to interact with a human. That's why they come to see a counselor as opposed to just, I don't know, seeking help online or something, or trying to self-diagnose and self-treat with materials they find online. So, being a human being is really helpful, and not just trying to be the subjective person on the other side of the room. Has actually shown to be really effective. So, thinking this next one's unique to couples counseling. So, thinking a couple as a couple. This is recognizing that couples within the LGBTQ plus community are facing some different issues than the heterosexual couple. So, that's not to say that all of our knowledge around relationship dynamics and healthy attachment and those kinds of things. It's not like we're throwing that out the door, but we are saying there are added elements for members of the LGBTQ plus community when it comes to being a couple, right? I mean, you got the two individuals, two or three, or however many individuals are in a relationship, and it is working with those individuals. And their individual experiences that they're bringing into the relationship. So you've got discriminatory experiences they've had, the trauma, and all the things that we talked about on the previous slide. They're coming in with that as individuals. They're bringing that into the relationship, and so you've got that to work with, and then you've got this experience of a couple that could be experiencing discrimination out in the world that a heterosexual couple might not. So there's just some added elements that we need to be aware of and need to be cognizant of when we are working with couples. So the other piece is failing to assess a client's coming out process or experience. We'll talk about this in a subsequent slide here in a minute. But we know that particularly around trauma symptoms, they can show up most significantly or most strongly during a coming out or staying in process, that transitional point to where a client's going to become outwardly more fully themselves. They're going to come out into the world, or they're choosing to stay in. They're kind of at the precipice of coming out. We know that's a critical point and can be a very difficult experience, cause a lot of distress and trauma symptoms. So knowing that, not assessing it can be really detrimental to the relationship. It can be detrimental to the counseling process because that's a critical piece of understanding the client's story and experience. So failing to assess that can be an error in therapy. All right, we're going to talk a little bit about growing up LGBTQ plus, and so this is looking at kids and adolescents, kind of that developmental time of life. And so the book makes a point that all lesbian, gay, or bisexual adults were once lesbian, gay, or bisexual kids. And it's an interesting point because I do think we often think about kids and maybe early adolescence as kind of non-sexual beings, which is completely untrue. And so it could be easy to, with that notion, it could be easy to think about someone not becoming who they are sexually until adulthood. And so we just need to, but that's a myth. So we need to acknowledge that that all individuals we work with within the LGBTQ plus community were once LGBTQ plus kids, adolescents, and just having that developmental perspective can be helpful in acknowledging their life experience that brought them to us. So another piece, and I think this is a helpful differentiation, that the LGBTQ plus kids and adolescents, their identities, which are forming as they are for throughout life, are not problems in and of themselves. The identity, that process of understanding who they are, how they identify, that's not a problem. The problem comes when their identities have to interact with these societal structures, whether that be family structure, peer structure, educational structure, the media that they are exposed to, religious structure that they have in place. those interactions are where problems arise. And that can be really helpful both for us conceptually, but also for our clients to understand that, this isn't you. Like, you're not the problem. It's the external factors that are causing the problems, that interaction between the client and these external factors. So it can externalize the problem. It can depersonalize the problem a bit for the client, just in terms of, this isn't like, nothing's wrong with you. It's how your identity is interacting with these problematic structures out in the world that's causing these issues. So that can be a helpful piece to make sure that we keep in mind. All LGBTQ plus children experience forms of neglect, abuse, and trauma. We're going to hit on the abuse and the trauma piece here in the next few slides. The neglect piece, this isn't necessarily the kind of overt neglect that we might think about with kids, whereas, like they're malnourished, or they're not exposed to social interaction, or those kinds of things. This is more um, saying that there are pieces of people that are neglected. And so for someone in the LGBTQ plus community growing up, if they are not able to fully express themselves, if they are hiding part of themselves, those parts of them which are really critical are going to be neglected. And so that's what we're talking about when we say neglect here. Again, it's a different form of neglect. It's not that kind of overt neglect that we may think of when we hear that word. And this restricted self gets at that idea of neglect, right? And so if we view the individual as a whole, as the real self, this is who an individual is. This is their experience. This is their identity. Um, they may only be putting out into the world a very restricted version of that. Therefore, the rest of it is getting neglected, if that makes sense. So, kind of the part that is shared with the world, is shared with family, shared with friends, shared with all these social contexts we just talked about. That is a very restricted version, and then there's all these things happening internally, understandings of self that never make it out into the world and therefore are neglected. So it really is a unembodied identity. Clients aren't able to be fully themselves when they are living this very restricted experience. All right, last couple chapters for this week. So chapter 4 talks about covert cultural sexual abuse, which is a term that might be new to you. What this term is meant to describe, here's the first bullet point, is the chronic verbal, emotional, psychological, and sometimes sexual assaults against individuals' gender expression, sexual feelings, and behaviors. If you tease apart the term covert, meaning these are not overt, right? These are things that are happening subtly. They may or may not be recognized. Cultural, meaning these are kind of culturally situated, societally situated. And then sexual abuse, which, we're very familiar with that term. So we're talking about things that are subtle, things that are culturally informed and broadly applied. And then we're talking about sexual abuse. And it parallels, the reason they use the sexual abuse term is because it does, this experience of covert cultural sexual abuse, the results closely parallel the symptoms of overt sexual abuse, what we might typically think of when we think about sexual abuse, that kind of, touching, fondling, intercourse against someone's will. The resulting effects are very similar, which is why they use this term. But this is the root cause of a lot of the issues and distress experienced by individuals within the LGBTQ plus community. So it can show up, you can see there the bullet points kind of equating lesbianism and gayness to adult sex. So this goes back to this idea of we often equate sexuality with adults, and we don't recognize that, sexuality is a developmental process just like anything else. And so we can easily equate, with that notion, it could be easy to equate lesbianism, gayness with adult sex and not with this developmental process for kids. And so just understanding that, we may not, we meaning culturally, like broadly speaking, we may not recognize that this sexual identity is developing pretty early on. And we may just think about it being as something that is situated in adulthood, which can be detrimental. The next two are around gender, so gender bashing and forced gender identity confusion. So remember that gender as a concept, as a construct, is socially constructed, right? So it is, we have made this up, right? When we think about, kind of stereotypical gender norms. Like I can think about this so easily with young kids. Like if you go into a toy store or you go into a clothing store, there is no question about which toys and which pieces of clothing are geared toward this very binary boy girl divide, right? And so looking at this idea of covert cultural sexual abuse, that kind of cultural message can be very confusing and cause a lot of distress for individuals whose identities don't fit this kind of like I'm a boy and I should wear blue, kind of cultural norm, gender norm that we've set up around this binary vision of gender. So gender bashing and forced gender identity confusion. Clients may come in experiencing this, trying to be put into a nice, clean gender box. And that can cause a lot of distress, understandably. And so just recognizing that that may be a symptom of covert cultural sexual abuse can be helpful on a clinical side of things. And then linking homosexuality with pedophilia. This is again a cultural myth that that say children need to be wary of homosexual men because they like kids, just because. So linking that idea of homosexuality with sexual attraction to kids, right? That is, there's absolutely no evidence to support it, but there's this kind of cultural myth, and that message can be really harmful to our clients in the LGBTQ plus community if they're hearing those messages growing up. It can really skew and cause a lot of shame, skew the perception and thought processes around their identity, and cause a lot of shame, guilt, and so those may be things that show up in the counseling context. All right, I think this is the last slide. I'm at 37 minutes. This went longer than I thought. So trauma resulting from growing up LGBTQ plus. So remember a couple slides ago, talked about trauma is going to be part of every LGBTQ plus member that we work with. And so recognizing that that trauma is going to be part of their experience, that just as a baseline, we can assume that that is part of their experience, can be really helpful to start out. But we also need to recognize where the symptoms show up and how they show up. So as mentioned before, that point of coming out or staying in, that decision around, do I exist in the world outwardly as I exist, as my identity is inwardly, is a really big kind of point of transition for clients. And again, we're talking, this could be for adults, but we're also, talking a good bit about kids and adolescents, kind of that developmental process. But we need to make sure that we're paying attention to that, how the trauma may show up, sexual secret keeping. So this is kind of that restricted self, right? I mean, there's parts of the sexual life and sexual desires, sexual attraction that may be kept secret from those that a client is closest to in their life. So that is one of the manifestations. Cognitive distortions. Again, this use that example from the previous slide of linking in a thought process, linking pedophilia and homosexuality is something that really has to be teased apart because there are these kind of covert cultural messages. And so, the cognitive distortions that can result from something like that are something that we can work with and help a client correct and get to a better place in terms of how they're thinking about things. All right, behavioral symptoms. These are ones that might show up. We know that behaviors are more easy to recognize. Clients might be more aware of them because they're kind of these concrete manifestations out in the world. So inappropriately sexualized affection, so just not having appropriate boundaries around sexual affection, preoccupation with sex, and so becoming kind of fixated on sex may be a symptom of trauma. Um, the deadening of emotions to avoid sexual arousal. So, if a client has linked this idea of sex being a bad thing because of their sexual attraction, sexual orientation, affectual orientation, one of the results, one of the coping mechanisms might just be to try not to feel anything, and then you don't have to deal with the sexual attraction on the flip side of those emotions. So deadening of emotions. So if you're working with a client and they just appear to be very flat, very detached from their emotional experience, which is a general a general symptom of trauma. This could also be associated with their identity. Isolating from others, again, general symptom of trauma. Short-lived relationships. So if the client is having a consistent pattern of short relationships, just not able to maintain a relationship, that could be a symptom of trauma. They're just having trouble existing fully as themselves in a healthy way, attaching in a healthy way to a partner. So that can be another sign of trauma. Settling for very little, just setting the bar low, just in terms of expectations of life, expectations of relationships, might be another sign. And then, of course, self-abuse, self-injury, and suicide are always, indicators of some kind of underlying trauma that we need to acknowledge and explore and work on with our clients. So that was longer than I thought. So 40 minutes. I hope that was helpful just to hear a little bit about these concepts. Again, I think the book does do a good job of explaining them and giving some really good examples. So please be sure to read the book. But hopefully, between the reading and then just hearing me kind of reiterate what the concepts are, they'll stick and you can use them in your work moving forward. All right, y'all. Thanks.